Great, we're going to get started. We've got an exciting group of panelists and we're going to talk about integrating gender dimensions into global, regional CRVS and legal identity initiatives. With us today is Niall McCann, technical advisor at UNDP on legal identity, Srdjan Mrkic, the Chief of Demographic and Social Statistics at the UN Statistics Division at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and Gemma van Halderen, who's the Director of she's the Director of the Statistics Division at the UN Economic and Social Commission for the Asia Pacific, and Tom Orrell, Director of DataReady. Given that we're a little bit pressed for time, I'm going to just get straight into it. Everybody knows these distinguished panelists, so we're going to invite Srdjan to start us off with a quick presentation, and then we'll move straight into a panel discussion and an open Q&A. Thanks, Srdjan. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Romesh. Dear colleagues, it is really a privilege to have this opportunity to address you at the end of the second day of this conference. This is not my first time at the conference, and with every time I enjoy it even more. Except the snow, of course, but then you cannot have everything. So the presentation that we would like to put in front of you refers to the United Nations Legal Identity Agenda, which is a concept that has been put together just recently at the initiative of the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. So what is legal identity? You have a definition here. The definition is the product of an intensive work by the United Nations Legal Identity Expert Group, which brought together all of the UN agencies that tackle the issue of legal identity one way or the other, together, of course, with the World Bank ID4D program that ensures, that focuses on issuing legal identity credentials in developing countries. You will see here from the definition, and I'm not going to read it, that essentially the legal identity is conferred to a person upon the birth and the issuance of the birth certificate by the Civil Registration Authority. It is being retired after the person's death, and then in the case that the civil registration did not function and the person did not get the birth certificate upon birth, then the legal identity can be conferred by an authorized identity agency. Why do we have this whole discussion regarding the legal identity? The purpose of it is to ensure that we are approaching from the longitudinal point of view, from the point of view of the birth to death sequence, and that we are talking very strictly about the issuance of the documents that certify the unique legal identity for each individual on the planet. It was not easy to achieve this kind of consensus among all the different components of the UN legal identity agenda, especially from the point of view that we well documented that the civil registration is not fully functioning in at least 50% of the countries, and that we have a number in millions of people without any kind of legal document. Solving the issue of the legal document by, for example, collecting biometric characteristics of individual and issuing some kind of legal identity credential may be a solution on a short-term basis. However, in the long term, it does not ensure the legal identity for all in perpetuity. So this, what you have in front of you, is the model of the UN Legal Identity Agenda that we are recommending that all the countries should implement by 2030 or earlier the better, in order to ensure that we have the universal registration of all vital events, and that we have the production of comprehensive and regular vital statistics together with ensuring the legal identity for all. You will see on the left side the life events, of course, births and deaths and marriages and divorces, and then what we have here also are other events, of which I would underscore adoptions as being one of particular interest, given the consequences they have for the person concerned. Then you have the second column, which is the formers. The third column is the civil registration system that transmits the information to the population register, that in turn transmits the information to the to the legal identity management. On the far right, you will see the production of the vital statistics. So this is the model that would, again, ensure universal registration of all vital events, that will ensure comprehensive vital statistics generated from the civil registration system. At the same time, that would ensure issuing the credentials that ensure the unique legal identity for every person concerned. The three components, of course, are here. So we are talking about civil registration quite a lot in terms of the source of vital statistics. However, the primary function of civil registration is very much linked to the two components, which is governance, a proper governance, and the second is human rights, ensuring the human rights, access to services, right to a name, right to a nationality. All of these are actually critical for the functioning of a civil registration system. The production of vital statistics is also, of course, very important, but it is a secondary byproduct of the civil registration system, which sole purpose is very much in the realm of legal circumstances of the countries. So this is just a very short explanation of the UN Legal Identity Task Force that has been put together in December just 2 months ago. And that's transitioned from the United Nations Legal Identity Expert Group. The expert group is co-chaired by the three UN bodies, which is UNDP, UNICEF, and the DESA Statistics Division. And we have UNECA as being the implementation agency for implementing UN legal identity agenda in the field. You have here also the members of the UN Legal Identity Task Force. So this is really within the UN system. The task force does not expand beyond the UN system. And here you have the 4 pillars. I'm not going to go through them. I'm sure that the organizers will make all of those presentations available after the end of the conference. Finally, the methodological framework. So what is that we have put together in order to assure the countries can really follow the recommendations of installing the model that has been presented in a most efficient manner. We have the principles and recommendations for vital statistics system. We have a handbook on civil registration and vital statistics management with a number of examples how the countries resolve the issue of holistic approach to civil registration, vital statistics, and identity management. We do have a very important component. We spoke a lot about the legislative framework for civil registration. We have a handbook that focuses on the need of the legislative framework for civil registration, vital statistics, and identity management. We have also, together with the Center of Excellence, we put together the Communication for Development handbook for the same topic that espouses the contemporary approach to build up communication in order to increase the registration of vital events. We do have the UN legal identity agenda guidelines for UN country teams. And finally, we have the strategy paper on how countries should implement UN legal identity agenda. And just to put this into perspective, we have initiated a pilot in 13 African countries, and the pilot is in full swing right now. Oliver Buhava was supposed to be a member of the panel and would provide much more information about it. But what we are right now in the process of doing is making sure that we are implementing and putting together the operational plans for implementing the UN legal identity agenda in countries where the civil registration is not functioning, or there is no link between civil registration and vital statistics, or there is the identity management system that is not linked to either the civil registration or vital statistics. Only in simultaneously tackling these three components, that is the message, the country can achieve, indeed, by 2030, the UN legal identity for all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Srdjan, for that comprehensive overview of the new initiatives around legal identity. I wanted to turn to our panelists. First of all, Tom Orrell from DataReady. We've heard a lot just from Srdjan, but over the past 2 days about these initiatives around integrating CRVS and legal identity systems, particularly through digital means. I think on the face of this, this offers enormous opportunity for inclusiveness and reaching those left far behind. I wonder whether, though, you could help us think through what some of the potential risks to this integration are, and in particular, how we as a movement might be able to move forward in a way that ensures opportunities and risks are balanced. In particular, when it comes to using ID and CRVS systems to overcoming gender inequities.
Right. Thank you, and thank you very much, Srdjan, for that overview. I think it's a really interesting initiative, and it's great to see that things have been thought through so well, and it's very well advanced and has progressed a lot as well. I think that there's a few reflections to make generally. Some of it might apply to your work, some of it might not. I'm not overly familiar, so I hope you don't interpret it as me being critical. It certainly isn't. But just to reflect on these issues more broadly. I think the starting point is absolutely right. As Srdjan pointed out, there are over 1 billion people in the world without ID, and there is an imperative to ensure that people do have a legal identity and they do have standing before the law. You know, we're all very familiar with what can happen in the absence of having an ID card and having legal representation, legal identity. And of course, SDG 16.9 reflects that. However, I do think that issues can arise, especially at the intersection of ID, CRVS, and human rights. And we've touched upon many of the issues over the course of the past 2 days. I think that there are 2 areas in particular that I wanted to highlight at this particular juncture, and I think it's perhaps a good juncture to do so as this framework is starting to be implemented and tested and piloted. I think the first is we need to be very cautious when explaining and introducing these initiatives, especially to policymakers and technocrats who are not that familiar with these systems, that a system is not a service. The development of a new information management system that brings together CRVS ID through digital means is not a service in and of itself. It's a means to then better being able to provide a more efficient service to citizens. I think that there is a tendency, and there certainly has been in the past few years, to think of technical solutions as gap fillers and as services in and of themselves, and I think that that's just wrong. We need to be very conscious of the governance dimensions of all of this, of the human dimensions, of the need to build capacities and do training around all of these rollouts to ensure that the systems which will be implemented and used help to generate efficiencies and help to make it easier to empower people rather than just become a technocratic and bureaucratic burden for people. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and again, this comes back to discussions we've been having over the course of the past few days. And again, I'm not familiar with the contents of all the guidance documents which have been produced, but I very much welcome Srdjan's explicit reference to things being rights-based and linked to empowerment. And I can't emphasize this point enough. We need to be very gentle and kind in the language that we use when we're engaging with people to enter them into these systems and when we're digitizing their data and their information. And I wanted to share actually a personal story in this regard, which relates to my life. I'm an illegitimate child, as it were. My parents are not married. They weren't even together until I was 10. They are now, thankfully. But a few years ago, it was just about 4 or 5 years ago, that I added my father's name to my birth certificate. And I'm a British citizen, so doing that in the UK was relatively straightforward. But then I wanted to have that verified and authenticated in Greece, where my parents live. Now, to do that, and my father is a naturalized Greek citizen. To do that, my parents had to sign a statutory declaration called, the legitimizing a child born out of wedlock declaration or something to that effect. And the precise wording has really stuck in my mind because my parents had to declare that I was the product of extramarital carnal knowledge. And it sounds just as bad in Greek as it does in English. But for my parents and for me, we all laughed, right? And the lawyer in the room at the time said, she actually said, it probably didn't feel that way at the time. But for women in particular who are more conservative and are more religious, which is very true for the part of northern Greece we live in, this would have been a deeply humiliating statement to have to sign. And I think there's a very serious point there about the language that we use in the tabulations and the forms through which we gather data. So my advice would be, in order to balance all of these rights, yes, absolutely, we do need to move ahead with integrated digitized systems. It is the way of the future. There are huge efficiency gains to be made. But as we do that, we need to ensure that there's very clear messaging around the fact that digital solutions are not services, and B, the language that we use to capture data and the way in which we do that must also be underpinned by human rights and a consideration of gender issues.
Thanks so much, Tom. I want to turn now quickly to Niall McCann from UNDP. There's a whole range of initiatives out there, some which have very, very close integration between civil registration and vital statistics systems and biometric legal ID systems, and others which are essentially operating fairly autonomously and essentially independently. I wanted, Niall, if you could walk us through a little bit of some of these tensions and opportunities around CRVS and legal identity strengthening. Srdjan gave us a very, very rich overview of the potential that a holistic approach to legal identity offers, particularly when it's grounded in a rights-based approach and a life course approach. What are some of the risks entailed in adoption of narrower approaches to legal identity strengthening that don't quite take this life course approach, and how best could we address these sorts of risks?
Thanks, Romesh. For about 20 years, I made my career in democracy support and elections work, and through a lot of UNDP's work supporting biometric voter registration systems, this kind of transitioned me over to the identity space where I've been for about the last 5 years, which frankly followed a lot of governments as well that were finally saying to UNDP after a number of years, we have spent all of this money and used all of this high technology that you have helped provide us with in order to register the adult population for one purpose only, which was to vote, when in fact that same technology and that same money could have been used for many, many different purposes, not just voting. It could have been used for social security systems, taxation systems, CRVS systems, driver licenses, everything, all of the various functional registers. So I have only been in the space 5 years, but I've noticed this tension that you mentioned, and I've noticed some, I think it would be fair to say, hardliners on both ends of a continuum of this debate. And if I look at some of the arguments I hear from one half of the continuum, it seems to be arguing things like CRVS has been around for decades, if not hundreds of years. It, in many countries, is disjointed, it doesn't work, it's slow, it's fragmented, it's underfunded, and basically it is slowing down the ability of governments to register their adult populations in particular if we embrace new technologies like biometric digital registrations. And as a means to break away from that, we are now going to do something like establish an entirely new agency, which tends to be centralized in a capital city, for example, and we're going to empower that agency to be the one that's going to register people over a particular age, be it 16-year-old or 18-year-old and above, in order to empower them with this digital ID with which then they can access various government services, and upon which countries can accelerate the movement or the achievement of financial inclusion and poverty reduction, etc. And the argument seems to me that when I hear people say this, they basically seem to be saying that there is a greater return on investment in registering adults digitally, taking biometric data, than there is from registering children. And which, in another way of saying that, it seems to me it's more important to register adults than it is to register children. And that doesn't surprise me in some respect, because I can see some particularly cynical government officials or international partners saying, at the end of the day, adults are economic agents in a way that children are not. Adults can cause an awful lot of political unrest in the way children cannot. Adults, from a purely financial point of view, yes, can access potentially things like the ability to register a mobile phone, open a bank account, start businesses, claim inheritance rights, quicker than a child is able to access something, because a child at the end of the day doesn't really access anything itself. It depends upon its mother, or in many cases both parents, to do so. And as a result of all of these tensions, I see this absolute clear message sometimes that we are going to put CRVS over here in the corner, and we're going to call that life events, and we're going to accelerate or enhance this other thing called identity. And we're going to separate those things out and not allow one to be infected by the other. I've actually been accused of, Niall, your problem is that you've been hijacked by the CRVS agenda. As if this was something bad, as if nobody in this room should be doing any of the work that we're doing. And that seems to me a terribly, terribly a bad way of looking at things, because if you are focusing on adults or 16-year-olds and above or whatever and saying, these are the priority, we've got to get these people in the system, it's a greater return on investment, and we're going to leave the children until later. There's two really fundamental problems we see straight away. One, at the younger side of the life cycle, how do you prove the identity of the teenager that you want to register for a biometric ID card or a national ID card, be that child 16 or 18 or whatever? If you have no birth certificate or no way to verify the identity of that child from birth up to the age of 16 or 18, then the potential for enormous manipulation of that process is there. Now, we have been doing in Malawi our national ID project for the last number of years, and phase 2 of it now does involve registering the children to try to get them into the same system that the adults are in. But the system up to this point has relied on witnessing to verify the identity of the teenagers. And while in a country like Malawi, thankfully, there is a certain trust in the village elders, tribal leaders to verify, and if they say this child is who that person says he is because I know the family, etc., that is trusted. That is not going to work in countries like Afghanistan, Syria after the war, countries that suffer enormously from identity politics and where politics around identity allows a manipulation. And finally, at the other end of the life cycle, how do you get dead people off your national identity register if your national identity register is not thoroughly and completely linked with death registration? You can have an awful lot of dead people clogging up your identity register pretty quickly. Now, one of the chief architects of one of the most well-known identity registers recently said to me when I asked him, how do you get dead people off the list? He basically said, we don't, and it's not important, because you can't clone the biometrics of a dead person, and therefore we don't worry about getting dead people off the list. And while I'm in opposition in the UN to criticize any member state of how they do things, a database that day after day after day is full of more and more dead people ultimately loses credibility eventually. And we do worry about the overall confidence that people will have in a system and in a database that is simply full of dead people at the end of the day.
Thanks so much, Niall, for giving us that overview of a lot of the tensions around CRVS and legal identity. The CRVS and legal identity landscape. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and zoom in closer to the ground and turn to Gemma. And I understand that we're just right on the midpoint of the decade for civil registration and vital statistics in the Asia Pacific. This October, you're heading into a big ministerial meeting of Asia Pacific ministers responsible for civil registration and vital statistics. Sounds like a real opportunity here to take stock of some of the recent achievements and then look towards some of the challenges ahead, particularly in the legal identity agenda. And so I wanted to hear a little bit about what these challenges look like, and if you could walk us through particularly how that plays out when we think about inclusiveness of women and girls.
Sure. Thank you very much, Romesh, and very warm greetings from UNESCAP. Sawadika to you all. I would like to just point out it's probably around 33, 34 degrees in Bangkok at the moment, and snow like that would not definitely be seen in large parts of the Asia-Pacific region. I'd also like to acknowledge some of my colleagues who are here today. Kami from the Fiji Ministry of Justice, who is the chairperson of our regional steering group on civil registration and vital statistics, with a colleague also from Fiji, Michael. We have delegation from Philippines, Lisa, Rosalind and Fred. And we also have Gloria from the Secretariat for the Pacific Community, who are here with us today. So as you mentioned, the Asia-Pacific region is coming up to a midpoint. So we actually identified civil registration vital statistics as a really important agenda in 2014. So it was the post-2015 agenda. And we actually identified this as a decade of action, 2015 to 2024. And it's a very important program in Asia Pacific, and reflecting on some of the conversations yesterday, is that this program is overseen by our UNESCAP Commission. So it's overseen by the equivalent of ECOSOC. So it's not overseen by the statistical community, it's overseen by the political level, ministers, mainly from ministers of finance, through our commission, and it's led by the policy community, not by the statistical community. And you saw this yesterday in Rosalind's speech around how countries like Philippines have adopted presidential decrees that recognise this decade. So we have it right from the policy level about the importance of civil registration vital statistics. We're moving into the midpoint of our decade, and it will be held this year. You're all very welcome to come to warm, sunny Bangkok and enjoy our hospitality. We have many of our partners who are co-hosting this event here with us today: UNICEF, UNFPA, UNDP, WHO, COE, the Centre of Excellence, UNSD. The list is quite extensive, and it's a true partnership. And so what are we hearing from countries so far? So we're currently getting information from all 58 of our countries, and there is a lot of pride in the progress that's being reported. On births, we are seeing large improvements in registrations. We're seeing legislative hurdles to single mothers to register their children are being overcome. We're seeing hurdles to equal access to documentation for both men and women being overcome. And the issue that we're seeing on the birth registration side is more to do with cultural challenges, cultural differences, not necessarily a gender challenge there. On deaths, we are seeing huge gender disparities in several countries, but we're picking this up because countries in Asia Pacific are trying to produce vital statistics through registration data, not through survey data. And so once you start using the registration data, you start seeing some gender disparities coming through. So on legal identity, I do have to acknowledge there was some confusion in what it means when we met a couple of years ago. It certainly wasn't on the agenda 5 years ago when we started the CRVS decade in Asia Pacific. And I really think it's fantastic, the UN Legal Identity Expert Group, which we're a member, and now the task team and many of you here. We can't thank you enough for bringing some clarity to the definition of what this means. Countries in our region at this ministerial conference have asked the ministerial conference to be used to advocate for a holistic approach to civil registration and vital statistics and identity management. And I think that the framework that's now available and the definition will be a really important contribution to bring some life to that, to our ministerial conference. Another goal of our decade is to produce better statistics based on civil registration records. And I mentioned yesterday this reliance on surveys, particularly the DHS, for reporting on vital statistics. I heard this morning from a colleague, I think it was a colleague from UNICEF, who said the DHS started 40 years ago as a short-term stopgap until we had proper population and vital statistics on the register. Well, 40 years later, maybe we should have a decade of trying to get rid of the DHS. Anyway, in Asia Pacific, we want to move forward and use the civil registration data, not survey data, for reporting on vital statistics. Because by doing this, can highlight some gender disparities. For instance, in Timor-Leste and Tuvalu, we're seeing that based on the registration data, under-registration of female births. In Kiribati, we're seeing higher death rates for women aged 15 to 59 based on the registration data. And in Georgia, The life expectancy of women is now 8.6 more years than for men, compared to only 7.5 years back in 1990. So if you're using this civil registration data rather than episodic surveys, you get some really rich information like this. So to me, a well-functioning civil registration, vital statistics is sort of fairly fundamental to understand the gender disparities that you can't get from a survey-based system as richly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gemma. Let's quickly move to Africa. I wanted to ask Niall McCann to kind of give us a little bit of an update. Africa is coming out of its ministerial meeting from last October, which was held in Lusaka, Zambia. And I understand that there was a number of renewed commitments around holistic integration of CRVS and legal ID at the ministerial level across the continent. Can you update us a little bit about what these commitments look like and how the UN Legal Identity Agenda Task Force is trying to support governments across Africa in advancing that agenda?
Thanks, Romesh. That question would normally have been dealt with by William Muava, who many of you may know, who couldn't be with us here at the moment, but he asked me to step in and address that issue. We are actually delighted in UNDP and as part of this task force that the Deputy Secretary General in particular wanted the UN Economic Commission for Africa to lead on the coordination of the UN support and the legal identity agenda in Africa, and that seems completely appropriate to us. And like you said, there were commitments made in the 5th Ministerial Conference of the African Programme for the Advanced Implementation of CRVS. That was held in Lusaka last October. And as Srdjan mentioned in his presentation, there's now a series of country assessments ongoing where a number of colleagues from the UN Economic Commission for Africa are visiting a number of member states to basically conduct a quick preliminary assessment that kind of summarizes what is the current state of not only CRVS, but if there are other identity management initiatives there, such as like the rollout of a national identity register, rollout of a national ID card scheme, and those types of ID schemes. What is the level of interaction, integration, interoperability, whatever terms we want to use, ongoing between those initiatives? Is there scope for greater interoperability between them? What is the current governmental appetite to try and have those two systems work together? And also, yes, very practically, is there appetite among the international community to support these efforts? Obviously, for example, the World Bank colleagues are doing an enormous amount of work in a lot of countries in Africa via support under IDA 19 and supported by the ID for Development Programme in Washington. And they are clearly a key counterpart for us moving forward when we try to work together as one international development community. And indeed, specifically, the DSG did want us to work together with the World Bank when helping to roll out the UN Legal Identity Agenda in Africa. And in fact, the countries that we are visiting at the moment, or that the ECA colleagues are visiting, were selected more or less using a series of criteria, one of which, for example, would be where birth certificate or birth registration rates are under 50%. And then another couple of countries, frankly, heard about the initiative and said, wait a second, we also need support in this area. So that's how we've ended up with 13 countries at the moment that the country assessments are ongoing in. Now, does that mean at the end of this assessment process, 13 joint World Bank, United Nations programs to solve all of the CRVS/identity problems that countries are going to be fixed? Not at all. The reality is, I would say it's likely and ideally by the end of this year, we would have formulated one United Nations plus World Bank initiatives in 3 or 4 countries that would allow us to really achieve something substantial with the national government, with national civil society, and with other major partners, frankly, like political parties. As much as we'd like to think that they're not key stakeholders, they are enormously key stakeholders in a lot of contexts if you're trying to build public confidence in the accuracy of a national identity register and particularly an integrated national ID and CRVS system. So what does UN World Bank interaction look like? That could, for example, then mean that the World Bank will have agreed a program of activity with the government, and that the UN also steps in now and does other elements, implements other parts of the same project in full agreement between the bank, the government, and the UN. Or, alternatively, it could be that the bank continues its financing of its project that it has agreed with the government, and then the UN would only provide some kind of, could be legal advice, could be some form of technical assistance advice, but without any substantial money, for example, going into the process. Or a third kind of model of interaction could be that the bank, in agreement with the government, might in some respects sort of fund the UN to be implementing part of the project going forward. These are some of the models on UN World Bank integration that we see as possible in the coming months. And I would like to think, like I said, by the end of the year, we will have designed projects that with the governments, with civil society, that we are able to then agree what is the funding model with the bank, and then where the UN has to come up with its own funds, able to mobilize funding from major international partners, not just from governments, but also potentially from groups like we heard this morning on the financing call, groups like the Gates Foundation or whatever, moving forward.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Niall. Lots going on, and very, very helpful update. I have more questions for the panel, but I'm going to ask them to indulge me to really open up to the floor. So I'm going to hold off on the additional questions and really invite our colleagues, both here in the room and online, to make a few interventions, if you can. The two microphones are right here on either side. Do we have any questions or comments from the floor? Gloria, please go ahead. And if anybody else wants to, please come up to the microphone so we can motor through a number of questions.
Okay. I'm interested in the 13 pilot country projects on the legal identity, on the UN integrated agenda on legal identity. And to front that, Pacific countries would be very keen on this kind of program. Most of them are in the very initial times of getting their ID systems in place. So in terms of a pilot, I think they would richly benefit from this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Do we have another question or two? Shida, please go ahead.
I'm going to take advantage of having a lawyer on the panel and ask a question.
Two lawyers, Srdjan.
Actually, two lawyers, great. So there's been a lot of discussions since yesterday on this sort of safeguarding against data privacy and data security, and some people even mentioned data ownership and so on. So I wanted to sort of take advantage of you to see if there's any comments you can make on how we can balance this safeguarding, not to go too much in either way of, getting things to sort of become, sort of, data, instead of misuse of data, it becomes misuse of data, kind of situation. So I appreciate that.
Excellent. Thanks, Shida. Can I open up to the floor? Niall, do you want to start, and then we'll move to Tom?
One thing I really do like when I get to talk at events like this is I can talk about my own country and not worry about whether I'm offending any other countries, and also talk about how we have messed things up, because I think we can be self-deprecating in Ireland a lot like that. We recently tried to introduce, or we have introduced, a public services card, which is a horribly named quasi-national identity card, and the people that just don't like it. We don't like it. It sounds like a national ID. We don't like it in the same way British citizens pretty much rejected the concept of a national ID card in the UK in 2010. And one of the major mistakes we have made in Ireland is, just as we screwed up electronic voting when we tried to introduce that, there was no proper public consultation with the people telling them, why are we doing this and what are we trying to fix? And if you don't have that kind of a conversation with the public, particularly when it comes to things like gathering more data from people and potentially mixing and merging that data in with other databases to potentially create this single point of failure in a state's management of citizen data. If you don't explain to people why you're doing it, for what purpose, and what's going to happen to their data, I feel like you're almost destined to fail from the very, very start. And one of the things you can do that I think would be enormously helpful in a lot of countries, and it's one of the reasons why I get frustrated that we don't spend enough time talking about institutional governance models when we talk about CRVS and bioidentity management. We don't talk about how beneficial it may well be to have proper information commissioners, properly legally mandated information ombudspersons, a one-stop shop of some form of body in a country that citizens can go to with concerns about how their data may have been abused or misused, and where they can lodge complaints and demand transparency and potentially get compensation, not necessarily financially, but from a government body who will investigate and see what happened to their data in any particular case. To me, that seems like a no-brainer. That should go hand in hand with the rollout of new digital identity systems or more interoperable CRVS identity systems, that there is at the same time equally apparatus set up that will allow people have somewhere to go and have somebody to protect their data for them. And an ombudsperson and information commissioner seems like a very easy, low-hanging fruit, to be honest with you. That would be an easy win for all governments, civil society, individuals, all stakeholders.
Thanks, Niall. Maybe following on from that, Tom, data protection risks framework?
Yeah, so, I mean, I completely agree with what Niall's saying. I think the biggest challenge and the biggest, perhaps, barrier to what you're saying, Niall, is the fact that many policymakers, many decision makers, quite frankly, just don't understand many of the risks. We have a huge task ahead of us in helping to clarify and to understand precisely some of the issues that Srdjan raised. So, perhaps I could give you just 2 or 3 examples from a kind of quasi-legal perspective. The first is around this concept of data ownership. Now, within legal circles, the whole idea of data ownership is a very contentious and controversial idea. If we start at the beginning, which is that data are fundamentally representations of facts. From a legal point of view, that creates huge problems when it comes to the concept of ownership. You can't assert ownership over facts. That's like trying to say that my name, Tom, belongs to me. That's absurd. It's quite clear that my name cannot belong to me. So what the law usually does, and in good data protection laws, what the law does is it creates a proxy for ownership through the ideas of data origination, so where the data comes from, the idea of data control, so who has control over pieces of data at various points in the data lifecycle, and the concept of data processing, who has the right to do what with what data at what particular juncture. So we need to be a lot clearer in the conversations that we have, and we need to be able to train people to understand that data flows, it's not static, it's representation of facts, and how you manage and govern data across processes, across flows as it interoperates with other data. If you start to get that straight in your head and you start to understand that there is this fluidity to it, it's a lot easier to then start to think about how you can identify foreseeable harms and risks and things like that. So that's the first area. The second area is around issues of privacy in particular. Again, there's huge confusion in my experience about what personal and sensitive data are, for instance. People seem to think that these are fixed points. And again, I'll give you a really good example about my name, right? So personal data, let's say we have a population register in the United Kingdom, and my name, Thomas Orrell, might appear 50,000 times. That's not personal data. Because if it's just a name on its own without any other attributes that can help to re-identify me, so my date of birth, my address, etc., if it's just the name Thomas Orrell, that is not personal data. However, if there was a population register in, say, Burkina Faso, and I happened to be living there, and my name appeared just on its own in Burkina Faso, but there was only one entry for Tom Orrell, it's very likely that would be personal data, because it would be very easy for then someone to be able to go and re-identify me as an individual. So the concept of personal data is very context-specific, and it depends on what other data points also exist. The more data points there are about someone, the more likely it's going to be personal data. Similarly, sensitive data, Cornelius and I were discussing this earlier. Sensitive data is not a fixed category. Historically, sensitive data is basically personal data which has historically been used to discriminate against people, so their sexuality, their religious belief, their political belief, etc. What Cornelius and I were discussing is, whether or not a cause of death on a death certificate can be considered sensitive data. And again, there's no straightforward answer. Context is everything. In most instances, it's probably not. But then we were talking about what if a situation arises where the cause of death was HIV, and this was in a society where HIV is taboo and is a stigma, and all of a sudden the disclosure of that to the public might have repercussions for the surviving family members. In that instance, arguably, that would be sensitive data. So again, we need to have very concrete discussions about what these terms mean from a legal point of view, and we need to educate people to understand this. The third and last example, if I may have just a moment, is around the meta risks, or what I call the meta risks. So coming to biometrics in particular, right, because this has come up. The biggest issues for me with biometrics is the fact that, again, people conflate biometrics with being identity. They are not identity. Biometrics are the means through which you can authenticate somebody's identity and through which you can identify somebody. Now, why is that important? That's important because when you start to look at biometrics through the lens of data protection principles, so for instance, the OECD's data privacy principles, you can start to apply like purpose specification, data minimization principles to biometrics. So what does that mean? That means that while they're a great tool to help us to verify ID, we need to be very conscious of the fact that it doesn't mean we should be going out there getting iris scans, fingerprints, facial things, in some cases DNA, earlobe metrics. We don't need all of those things. We need to get maybe 2 or 3 of them. One is probably not enough because none of them are deterministic. They're all just a matter of probability in terms of being accurate. So 2 points is probably enough to then be able to reasonably identify somebody. The people who are rolling out these systems need to be aware of all of this and how it all operates. The bigger issue for me in terms of these meta issues as well is then the algorithms which are used to process all of this data and to do the verification. Who owns those? Are they proprietary? Are they open source? What's the public oversight of this? We're all familiar with the concept of AI bias. It comes up in the news all the time, right? We know that these algorithms which are developed to recognize faces automatically discriminate against women and people of color. There's a huge gender component to this. What if they're routinely getting it wrong in these systems? If the company who's selling the algorithm to the UN agencies and to the country to do this have trained it all on white men in California, it's very likely that they're going to be getting it wrong in Malawi in terms of the authentication. So we really need to be a bit smarter in the way that we think about all of this. Those are just 3 examples from a more kind of techno-legal point of view about some of the issues at play. But these problems are only going to get more acute and they're going to get more challenging if we don't start to educate ourselves about what these technologies really mean and what good data protection and good data privacy practices really look like. And I should actually not say data privacy, I mean individual privacy over their information, what these practices really look like.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. I think that's enormously helpful to clarify a number of points of confusion and educate about some of the nuance here. I think these are critical for a more informed discussion and a more informed, coordinated approach to a number of these issues. I'm very, very conscious of the time. I think we have time for one burning question, if anybody has it. Shaida, you usually have the burning question. Well, I'm going to ask it and use the chair's privilege. And I want to direct it at Srdjan Mrkic, if I may. We've heard a lot over the last 2 days about social norms and behavioral factors that really perpetuate and drive the invisibility of, particularly of women and girls in civil registration and vital statistics systems. I think Tom just mentioned a number of pieces here in terms of things becoming more complicated and nuanced as we move into broader legal identity systems underpinned by digital and biometric authentication. I wonder whether you might kind of help us understand how you see this playing out, and in particular, what some of the challenges are and how we should effectively address them more systematically.
Yes, indeed. In the practice of monitoring the functioning of civil registration and vital statistics system around the world, it becomes quite apparent that there are several points that need to be addressed every time. And one of these issues is the disparity between the tradition, the social norms, and the law. And of course, the starting point should be the legislative framework. If the legislative framework is not put together in a contemporary manner, in a non-biased manner, then it would be very difficult to implement it in the field and then to try to change the behavior of the population. However, even when the law is put together properly, we still need to overcome these kind of obstacles due to the tradition, due to the social norms, due to the stigma. We just mentioned, for example, the cause of death being put on the death certificate. Our international standards strictly forbid doing that, especially because of the point of the not stigmatizing the family of the deceased person, and so on and so forth. But this is very common in a number of countries, and even they put it in the newspapers. So when you have the mortuary, you have also the cause of that, which definitely is traditional, but then it's against the law, it's against the rule. How to overcome it? I believe that one of the attempts that we are trying to do is through the communication for development, raising the awareness of the population, making sure that they understand the consequences of not complying fully with the law. But the other point that is not often discussed, but proved to be extremely effective in a number of countries, is incentives. And incentives really work wonder. We do have, in a number of countries, for example, instituting in a certain province, giving the family of the deceased an average salary of that country for funeral expenses. All of a sudden, the death registration skyrocketed. And this is the way of, for example, overcoming those social norms, overcoming those traditions, in making sure that there is incentive. In a number of Latin American countries, for example, when they were trying to boost their registration of births, the mothers were given some kind of initial baby care products upon registration. So the incentives can be expressed in a different way, but they are never really discussed as a kind of a strategy in a given country. We are talking about the penalties from the law, but we are not talking about the incentives. And then finally, what I believe, and in the interest of time, I won't go much deeper into this, it is the fact that this is a government service, and the government service has to be delivered, and someone has to be responsible for not delivering the service. So it has to be government-owned. It has to be mandatory, but mandatory on both sides. On the side of the population, registering the events, but mandatory on the side of the government to provide the facilities to deliver those services. And this is something that, again, we are putting at the forefront of our activities, but needs to be emphasized much stronger, that this is the responsibility of every single government that signed all of the international treaties, including the Treaty on Children, that if you are not delivering on your responsibilities, you are actually in a breach of international human rights legislation. And we are not using that argument often enough. And I believe that we could be using it much more often in order to make sure that the governments are shaken up a bit and understand their responsibility of delivering to their population what they have promised.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Srdjan. And let me thank all of our panelists today, and particularly for sharing these insights and perspectives with us. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, addressing questions around social norms, data governance, data protection standards, tensions between civil registration, vital statistics, and legal identity, and some of the barriers towards inclusiveness. I want to invite all of our colleagues to join me in thanking our panel today.